While working as a human rights activist, did you ever imagine that you would be at some point abducted and tortured?
Well, to be honest, I never wrote it out because I know as a human rights activist that these things do happen in Russia. More often they happen to ordinary citizens, but it also happens to human rights activists. In this respect, I was a bit prepared for what happened, but of course, still you don't expect it to happen today, now, and when it happens, it's still a shock.
What do you recall from that particular day?
Well, actually, I was in Ingushetia, which is a small republic next to Chechnya, which used to be more or less safe for activists, but such kidnappings do take place there. And just a few months before I arrived, one of the leading police officers in Ingushetia was sent to prison for specifically this kind of activities. But when I came there, everything was looked very safe, very tranquil, and there appeared to be no threat, no risk whatsoever. And my main thoughts were like, this is kind of a little bit boring trip, and not much is happening, so I should just go home and work on things that are more important.
And then the terror began. So what happened? How did it get triggered?
Well, it was late in the evening. On the eve of me going back to Moscow, I was in my hotel room and somebody knocked on the door. This was a man I had never seen, and he asked me if I wanted to meet with one of the leaders of the protest that was taking place at that moment. And I came to Ingushetia to monitor this protest. I was surprised because I never told anyone in which room I was staying, but I thought, well, I guess they just asked at the reception. So I said, yeah, of course, it's my job to meet with people to learn more perspectives. And I came down, and that person said, you see this guy, he's afraid of being arrested, so he doesn't really walk on the street, so can you get into this car? And this was, of course, in retrospect, I understand that this was stupid, but I thought, okay, yeah, if I have to, if I want to meet with that person, I have to get into that car. And when I got into the car, things got wrong. And I realized that something is bad because nobody was in the car initially. But after a few seconds, two men got in. They had masks on their faces. They had caps on their heads, so you couldn't recognize them. You only saw their eyes. And they immediately demanded that I hand over my mobile phone, and they searched me. They disabled the phone so that it couldn't be tracked. And then we drove somewhere, and en route they were asking me questions. Who are you? Why did you come here? Who pays you? What do you want? Why are you storing troubles in our republic? And things like that. And I think they didn't really know who I was. I think what they saw was somebody who came from Moscow, who was meeting with local activists, asking questions, talking to people. So we should just kind of show him who's the boss here and try to extract as much information as we can from him. So then I was taken to a field somewhere in the middle of nowhere, probably not far from this city, the city of Magas in Ingushetia, the capital of that republic. And then I was undressed, I was beaten up. They 2 times said that they were going to shoot me and put the gun to my head, saying like, are you praying now? But it was mostly kind of a psychological pressure. I, being an optimist, or just was it a kind of psychological mechanism of self-protection? I wasn't really scared. I was surprised that I didn't feel fear. I felt like I was watching a movie, actually. And the strange feeling was that I wonder how this movie is going to end. And so I kind of looked at myself from the third-person perspective.
Fortunately, it ended good. You are still here. But what has changed for you after this event?
Well, of course, the thing that most unnerved me were threats against my family. And I understand perfectly well that there is no way I can completely protect my family, and the government will not care about protecting them. So for some time we had to stay in a different country.
How dangerous is it to be in Russia a human rights activist, a journalist, or even a political opponent?
Well, to give an example, actually out of my friends who were either political or human rights activists, I think several dozen have left the country over the past several years. Some of them left because they saw no way forward, but many of them were under immediate threat of being imprisoned, arrested, or physical threats to them or to their families.
What would you say are the solutions for fighting governments, for fighting groups which are threatening human rights?
Well, I think all range of methods that a democracy gives citizens, it has to be used. Elections, courts, independent media, the internet, all of this plays a huge role, especially as long as you have it. Actually, by risking your lives, or risking your freedom, risking your job, risking your well-being, you demonstrate how important this problem is to you. And unfortunately, in many cases, people do not just care enough about their rights, or they think their rights are not directly affected. Like, this law doesn't apply to me, it only applies to my neighbor, so why should I risk anything for them? And next time the neighbor will not go in solidarity with you. And unfortunately, it means that people have to be prepared to suffer for what they believe in, for what they stand for. Hopefully in Romania and in most EU countries, you will not be imprisoned for peacefully protesting, but in many cases people still, at least they will feel bad if they participate in protests that are not favored by the government. Sometimes you can have problems with your job. Sometimes you can be targeted by a smear campaign in pro-government media. But again, this is something that you have to be prepared for if you want to fight for your rights. If you don't want to fight for your rights, eventually you may find yourself without any rights.
Our world is under many threats, from illiberal regimes that are taking power to climate change. What would you say is the worst case scenario that we can expect, and which would be the best case scenario?
Well, if we're talking about the global worst case scenario, of course, all sorts of global catastrophes can take place, including, I don't know, a world war. I think it is unlikely. I think even in spite of all the chaos we see now in the world and all the craziness and all the incompetence of politicians, I still believe that some kind of instinct of self-preservation will prevail. But at the same time, I think that we are going to see a lot of ugly things, maybe new wars, maybe democracies falling apart and being replaced by autocracies in some countries over the next years. At least this trend that has been that we have seen in the last about 15 years of democracy giving way to more autocracy, of the global level of freedoms and civil rights decreasing. It hasn't been reversed yet, and probably we will see more and more problems. But it also creates opportunities for people to realize that nothing is granted, that the rights and liberties that they are used to can be taken away from them. So unless, and I'm returning back to the previous point, unless you actively participate in civil life, unless you actively stand up for your rights, you can lose all of this. So you have to pay at least some attention to what is happening in your country. Speaking of the best case scenario, I am an optimist, and I truly hope that eventually, maybe not in very near future, maybe not within 10 or 20 years, but eventually most of the world will become democratic. For most of the people, human rights will be a reality.
What would you miss about the country?
I hope it's not going to happen, and I think that so far I am able to contribute to improvement of the situation in Russia, or at least to protecting what freedoms and rights we still have there. But of course, I will miss the great people who I know, who may themselves feel a minority, but I'm sure that, in fact, most Russians, like most people in every country, want to live decent lives. So I will miss my friends, I will miss the people I used to work with, I will miss the opportunities to impact the lives of these people. I will miss my city. I'm fond of Moscow, and I very like that town. At the same time, I think that there are many more similarities between people all around the world than there are differences. So anywhere you go, you see that people basically want the same things. They may disagree about the means, but they still want a decent life. They want them to be recognized as individuals. They want their rights to be observed. They want to live in peace, and they want to have dignity.